is the Electoral Dysfunction Podcast with Ashton Cohen.
Welcome back to the Electoral Dysfunction Podcast with Ashton Cohen. I'm Ashton Cohen. I'm joined today by Dr. Yuval Levin. Yuval, I think, is one of the most astute observers and thinkers in terms of American politics. He worked in the George W. Bush administration, is now a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. You may have seen his columns in Wall Street Journal or New York Times, a bunch of other places. He has also written several books. The most recent one is titled A Time to Build. So we're going to talk about American politics and also American culture, why that's so screwed up right now, why we're just going from crisis to crisis and screaming match to screaming match about literally everything, it seems like, and if we could ever hope to change that. So, Yuval, thanks so much for being with me. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, listen to your conversation with Barry Weiss from a couple days ago. Excellent conversation. We'll need to revisit the whole thing. People should check it out if they haven't already done so after listening to this. But if you could, I think it's a good place to start in terms of, they often say politics is downstream from culture, right? It's a derivative of culture. What are the dominant cultural trends shaping our politics? And is our current cultural political situation unprecedented? Should we be worried about it?
Well, yeah, I think it certainly is true at any time in America that politics is largely downstream of culture, although there are also a lot of times when the culture is shaped and affected by the nature of our political divisions. And I do think that this is a moment when the two are unusually closely connected to each other. One just overwhelming fact of our culture at the moment is the simple fact of polarization or division, which could be understood as a political fact, but it's not simply political. What we're polarized around has a lot to do with what we think of as the culture war, which is really a divide between, I would say, two ways of living now in America, two ways of thinking about the relationship between the government and the people. And ultimately, I think one key fact to really see about our culture in this moment is that our life in America is defined to an unusual degree by the distance between what we think of as the elite and the broader public. This happens. Right. It's not totally unprecedented. There are a lot of populist moments in American history, but it's worth seeing that this is a populist moment in American life, and that we also have a cohesive, unified elite to an unusual degree in our society now. Sure. Very often in American history, we've had competing elites, overlapping elites, so that the people who ran major corporations, say, were pretty different from the people who ran universities or Hollywood studios or government agencies. These were different kinds of people. They had different kinds of education. They came from different places in our culture, and they competed with each other. At the moment, a lot of our elites in these institutions are pretty interchangeable. The people who run the biggest companies are actually a lot like the people who run university English departments and the people who run major newspapers and Hollywood studios. They all went to one of the top 5% of American colleges. They learned more or less the same kind of things there, and they're culturally very similar to each other. So that elite being so cohesive also means that our anti-elite politics is very concentrated. And we're just living in an up-down moment as much as a left-right moment in America. That has everything to do with our political culture right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, if you go from, there was a point, I presume, where people from LA and New York and Philadelphia and several of these other cities probably were a bit different, even though maybe some of the politics overlap, maybe some of them didn't. But now you can go to, sort of the elites of any one of these cities, and it's essentially the same thing, right? There's a significant overlap in their beliefs, in their way of life, and what media they consume, even what they eat, right? The kinds of restaurants.
Yeah, there's really been a centralization. There's been a kind of consolidation of elite culture. And you see it especially in the differences between the public and private sector. The people who run major corporations come from the same cultural space as the people who run government agencies, as the people who run universities and a lot of our cultural institutions. And so that really does create a situation where the rest of the country feels like there is an elite and it is responding to it, so that our anti-elite culture is also very cohesive. And we're polarized, right? There are two options. You're either on this side or on that side. And a lot of the difference is more like an up-down difference than it is like a left-right difference. And I think that has a lot to do with the character, the flavor of this cultural moment. It doesn't explain everything, but it's a really distinct feature of 21st century American life.
Yeah, it is so odd, and it's kind of like that. You see this a lot too, and I see with sort of a lot of the people I went to university with, for example, and they, especially during the Trump presidency, right? They would think there's some part of a resistance, or they're for the working folk or the common. It's like, you guys don't have any working class friends. And you believe the same
Right.
exact things as Bezos or Zuckerberg or a lot of the Goldman Sachs guys now. Even that, they predominantly supported Biden. And it's like, what are you talking about exactly, right? It's like you had
Yeah.
the same views as executives of most major public corporations, and that's one thing. I mean, that's fine, I guess, but it's not like this is the Democratic Party of the Jimmy Hoffa times, or 1960s, and the UAW types. Um, so I want to come back to that in a
Yeah.
second, but there's also, you talk a bit about polarization. With the One of the things you often hear is in terms of, I think you hear a lot of reasonable people say this, who are centrists, or maybe slightly center right or slightly center left. They'll say something along the lines of, well, both parties are to the extreme, right? There's so much polarization amongst both parties, and there definitely is polarization. But I want to get your thoughts on this, because on one hand, let's look at the Democratic Party. So Joe Biden of today believes or professes to believe very different things than Joe Biden of, say, 1980s, right? Joe Biden of the 1990s was a major, ardent supporter of the crime 94 crime bill. He was, the guy who would sort of wax on incessantly about how crack cocaine is so much more dangerous than cocaine, and all that, right? He was kind of more of a,
Yeah.
what we would consider a, almost like a Joe Manchin type, basically.
Yep.
And certainly there's a significant difference between Biden and the Clinton administration, the Bill Clinton administration, which I was essentially born and raised under. Bill Clinton, end of welfare, we know it. You can never imagine a Democrat saying that today. And then we switch to the Republican side, and you say, okay, so look at Trump versus Reagan, and that was 1980s, obviously. Certainly the rhetoric of Trump is more abrasive, and it's more extreme. Are the policies that much different? Or, because I think that the stronger argument would be that Trump is maybe to the left on Reagan on some significant issues, such as free trade, um, certain economic issues, certainly in terms of military intervention. Certainly, he ran on the approving of gay marriage, right? Which it took Biden until 2012 and Obama, their second term, essentially, to be in support of that openly. And Trump probably a bit more nuanced in terms of big corporations and how to treat them, because there's a bit of a culture war there, as we discussed, and probably more moderate on issues like antitrust than Reagan was. So do you see that both parties have sort of gone to the extreme in terms of policy, or is it just like Democrats have gone like 10 steps in one direction and Republicans maybe a step?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think in a way Joe Biden is a nice way to think about this, because Joe Biden has spent his entire career putting himself at the center of the Democratic coalition. He's thought of as a centrist, but he's not a centrist broadly speaking. He tries to be at the very middle of his party coalition, and in the 1990s, that meant he was, as you say, a moderate when it came to crime, when it came to welfare. Earlier than that, in the 1980s, it even meant that he was pro-life, and Joe Biden was pro-life until 1988, when he ran for president. And gradually, as his party's coalition moved leftward, you could see Biden moving leftward to stay in the middle. And he is still, I think, more or less in the center of the Democratic coalition. But now that place is quite a left-wing place to be. The story of the right is a little more complicated. I mean, in a way, it's almost hard to say what would be left and right on some of the issues where the right has changed, especially trade and immigration. Donald Trump is certainly much more on the side of restricting immigration than Ronald Reagan was. Reagan was almost an open borders conservative, not quite, but he signed an amnesty bill in 1986 and was very, very pro-immigration. Trump is not, and most Republican politicians now are not. Reagan rhetorically was more of a free trader, although he did use tariffs and other trade policy vehicles to advance the national interest as he saw it. When it comes to practice, he wasn't actually that different from Trump, but certainly they spoke very differently about trade. And on some issues, there's no question that the entire terrain has moved to the left. And so what it now means to be on the right is not as far on the right as it used to be. In other ways, that's not true. I mean, the Republican Party is now much more cohesively a pro-life party. There were a lot of pro-choice Republicans in the 1980s and even into the 90s. There are very few now. You could say the same thing, for example, about Second Amendment rights. The Republican Party is now much more united on protecting access to guns than it used to be. And so by picking your issue, you could say one party's moved more than the other. What's really distinct, what's really different, it seems to me, is that there are far fewer people in the middle. The party coalitions have become more cohesive, and the parties now, as a whole, have clear positions on these issues. And there's much less intra-party factionalization than there used to be. There are a lot fewer conservative Democrats. There are a lot fewer liberal Republicans. And I do think that on the whole, the Democrats have moved left more than the Republicans have moved right. But what's most significant is that the body of voters in the middle isn't there to the degree that it was. One thing that's meant is that we have much closer elections now. There isn't this massive body of centrist voters that could go either way. You know, Ronald Reagan won re-election in 1984 with 49 states. He won 49 of 50 states in the Electoral College. He had 62% of the vote. That is not going to happen anytime soon for either party. There are far fewer winnable voters now who could swing either way, and you know that what it means even to win comfortably is very, very different than what it used to. And we've been living now through really a 30-year period of extremely close elections, where control of Congress is up for grabs just about every time, where control of the presidency most of the time is up for grabs. It's worth seeing how unusual that is. That's not normally how American politics works. Most of our history, there's been a dominant majority party and a durable minority party. They've switched places sometimes, and we call those realignments. But when they switch places, then you had a new durable majority for a long time. So that, from if you just think about the 20th century, from 1896 until 1930, Republicans won the presidency all but 2 times. So they won 5 of 7 presidential elections in that period, and they controlled Congress most of that time. 1932 to into the 1960s. 1932, the Democrats won the presidency 5 times in a row, right until 1952. Then Republicans won the presidency. You can think about a 40-year period from the 1950s to the 1990s, where Republicans were winning the presidency most of the time. Democrats controlled Congress the entire time. The sort of moment we're living in, where it just goes back and forth constantly, and it's never clear who the majority is very unusual and has a lot to do with why our politics feels the way it does.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Everything you said, I agree with. It's very interesting because talking about the issues with the Second Amendment, how that's become much more consolidated. It's true. I mean, I'm probably even a product of that to a certain extent, because I was always, from a child, never understanding about the opposition of gay marriage. But the Second Amendment was something I was always pretty firm on, growing up in California and having parents who were immigrants and sort of escaped, especially my mom's side, totalitarian takeover of her country. In terms of, okay, so like I said, we have a very interesting time with the parties. And it feels like no one quite knows what they want to be, right? Because Democrats still have that narrative of being like that working class party, which is, a hangover from the 60s. But then you point out that, hey, like 10 of the 10 wealthiest zip codes in the United States were all Democratic. Most billionaires seem to be Democratic. Wall Street overwhelmingly supported Biden over President Trump. And then there was this Bloomberg survey, which I'm sure you probably saw from 2020. So the most likely people to vote for Trump were truckers, construction workers, carpenters, builders, electricians, cops, mechanics, and maintenance workers. And the professions that highest percentage went to Biden were professors, therapists, lawyers, HR department staff, finance professionals, and bankers. So it's very, very hard to call yourself sort of that working class party when all your support is coming from a different class. And then on top of that, it's interesting because there were like, so for example, Trump, we had the corporate tax cuts. So that's still a sort of hangover from what the Republican Party has traditionally been. It still is to a certain extent, which is, a pro-business, diminishing regulations kind of party, also trying to appeal to the working class. But then the left has all these big corporations on their side. So it's very odd. Like, how do you see these things shaping up? Do you think that there's going to be a cementing of coalitions between the left and the right in a few years, or is that the wrong paradigm to think of it?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, in a way, the two parties have both had trouble coming to terms with the changing character of their electoral coalitions. In a funny way, you might say the Republican Party has gradually come to have a coalition that looks a little bit like the New Deal coalition, which is to say, working class white voters and a kind of ethnic voters who are becoming white, which in the New Deal you might have said that about Southern European immigrants. Now we would say that about Hispanics,
Right.
and that's a broad coalition in America. The Democratic Party coalition is gradually becoming something like the Eisenhower coalition, which is educated white voters and African Americans. And neither party thinks of itself this way at all. If you tell the Democrats, well, you kind of look like the Eisenhower coalition, I think it would be a surprise and an insult to a lot of Democrats to think that. But that was a durable coalition. That was a way to govern the country for quite some time. And it could be again, but they would have to lean into it. They would have to understand that that they are now the party of the elite, and that they have to think that way, to approach the institutions that way, to think about their priorities that way. And of course, for Republicans, if you're going to have the New Deal coalition, you got to offer them something like a New Deal agenda, which means basically thinking about how government can improve the lives of working class people. There are Republicans who are trying to think that way, but on the whole, the party still is not in that place. And even when it pays kind of rhetorical lip service to working class priorities, the party still, if you wake up a Republican member of Congress in the middle of the night and ask him, what do you want to do? He'll say, cut taxes. It still feels a little bit like the party thinks of itself as essentially the party of Wall Street. I think that as the parties come to terms with the characters of their coalitions, you'll just inevitably see some changes in the way they think about the role of government and in the way they think about their place in the system. I don't think that means the Republican Party becomes a left-wing party or the Democrats become a right-wing party. There's certainly a right-wing way to be the New Deal coalition, and to emphasize some of the kinds of concerns of working-class families that conservatives can certainly speak to. But the parties have to see that this is what they now need to offer. The two parties, in a way, are stuck in a long-standing debate. They're still having the arguments that have defined the life experiences of the baby boomers. And both parties are still dominated by boomers. Donald Trump is 74 years old. And Joe Biden is
Biden's not even a baby
years
boomer.
old. So
Yeah.
Biden's not even a baby boomer, right? And both parties are run by people born in the 1940s, and our country feels like it was born in the 1940s. It feels like its heyday was, in the 50s, early 60s. It feels like it was sort of comfortable in the 90s, and now it's over the hill, and who knows what the future holds. But that's not right. That's not our country. We have a very bright future in America. When you think about the kinds of resources that are available to us for building our future, there's a lot we could be talking about. And we're not. We're talking about grudges from the heyday of the boomers. We're talking about taking, great society programs and putting for all at the end of them. That's not a strategy for America's future. And in a sense, both parties are stuck in this kind of nostalgic place rather than thinking about what does the future require and what really are the electoral coalitions we're working for? Whose priorities are we advancing? So I actually think this is connected to what we were speaking about before, which is a generation of close elections has kept the parties from having to learn hard lessons about who they are and who they're not. Politicians learn from big wins or big losses, which means that neither party has learned anything in 30 years. And our politics kind of looks like that.
I mean, that is such a good point. I never thought about it in terms of the New Deal coalition, Eisenhower coalition. It actually makes a lot of sense. That does seem to be a pretty good analogy of where things are heading, and also I think your point's excellent about the politics are still being dominated by people in their 80s and 70s, and so they're still coming at this from that mindset of the era they grew up in, which was the
Yeah.
60s and 70s and 80s.
That point is really important to understand. It's really the president, as I say, 79. The Senate majority leader is 73. Minority leader is 79. The Speaker of the House is 80 years old. This is a very unusual situation. It is not normally how American politics works, and I think it contributes something to the spirit of this moment, which is not a great spirit.
Yeah, and I think instinctively some of the younger people, whether they be on the left or the right, kind of know that the coalitions are different, and you kind of see that in the way some people discuss things on Twitter. And I think Tucker Carlson's probably a pretty good poster child of what the Republican Party or the right is kind of morphing into, which is, yeah, maybe a bit more of a populist. He's somebody who advocates for essentially what Poland does, which is paying people for having children, right? That's not a Reagan thing at all. And of course,
Yep.
a more hardline on immigration, and the analogy between the Hispanics and say the Italian immigrants of the old days seems to be quite apt as well. And it's something I started to notice even in high school, because we always think of Hispanics as a different race, but I assume we probably thought of Italians as not being white either back
Yeah,
when they were
absolutely.
first coming here as well.
If you had told
And yeah, no
people
one says
like
that anymore.
I mean, look, if you had told my wife's grandparents, Jews living in Scranton, Pennsylvania in the 1940s, 30s and 40s, that they would be considered white in 2020 in America,
Hmm.
they would have laughed in your face. That was
Right.
preposterous. They were an ethnic minority, not just a religious minority. And we just don't think that way anymore. We've decided that that's not the case. And
Hmm.
I think something like that is clearly happening to Hispanics in America. And they're
Hmm.
going to be thought of as part of a kind of white majority in another 2 generations. And the politics of that will follow a similar path to what you saw with kind of ethnic Catholics, Irish, Italian, Polish, in the course of the 20th century, who also would not have been thought of as white until amazingly recently.
Right. Right. And do you think so when we're talking about the top down elite working man sort of paradigm, or or putting those people in sort of separate boxes, do you think that maps on relatively well to the right left divide now? And that's so, because that's the cultural phenomenon, then there's the political phenomenon. How do you make sense of that?
Yeah, I think it's not a perfect mapping, but it is increasingly mapping on to the left-right divide. I mean, I do think that there's a sense in which um, the right in America is coming to understand itself as more like the party of the broad public. The left gradually, whether it likes it or not, is becoming a party of the elite. And America's two-party system has often meant that one party tends to represent the city and the other tends to represent the country, or one party tends to represent more like the elite,
Hmm.
the other is more of a broadly popular or populist parties. This hasn't always mapped in the same way when it comes to left and right. We're in a place now where the parties are very sorted when it comes to ideology. The Republican Party really is the party of the right. The Democrats are the party of the left. There are not big regional differences that divide the parties. There are ideological differences. But those ideological differences increasingly have to do with your view of the tension between the elite and the broader public in America. And so I think the right is becoming more populist and the left more elitist. It's a gradual
Hmm.
process. The parties are not fully sorted that way. But I think that's the trend in our politics, no question about it.
And real quick, regarding that New Deal point about how that it's sort of analogous to the coalition that Republicans may be in, the new the New Deal coalition, were there big businesses in that as well, or was it just mostly focused on sort of these small time businesses?
Yeah, it's a good question. Broadly speaking, big business was not in the New Deal coalition. And
Okay.
I think there is a way in which we're seeing something like that happening now too. The Republican Party
Mhm.
is losing its deep connection to big business, and you gradually begin to see the Chamber of Commerce siding less with Republicans and trying to
Right.
play with both parties more. And I think that's unavoidable. I mean, the big business is part of the American elite. Whatever that means in the moment, it's going to be part of that. And the ties between Republicans and big business in a generation from now are not going to be what they were a generation ago. I think that's unavoidable.
Yeah, and I think the current situation with DeSantis, who's like the one of the cultural icons of the right now, going up against Disney against this what they refer to as the "Don't Say Gay" bill, which essentially just prohibits teachers from being able to speak about sexual topics to K through 12, no, kindergarten to third graders essentially is from my understanding of it. And so it's very unusual to see a in the past a Republican governor who has sort of broad popular support in his state by the masses going up against the state's biggest employer, right? That's kind of
Yeah,
unusual in
right.
itself. It's very interesting.
Hmm.
Do you think that we're pretty much just tied to a two-party system for all intents and purposes? Because obviously we have a different situation than France or something like that, or some of these European countries. One of the more interesting things that came out of France in that last election with was you had like their equivalent of the I guess the center right and the center left, maybe like the Republicans, Democrats, not even making it into the runoff, and then Macron comes in,
Yep.
creates a brand new party, and he's going against a like a far right party that didn't really have any traction before, and with Marine Le Pen. You think anything could ever be possible like that in America, or this is pretty much the system that we're gonna have for a while?
Well, the underlying structure of our party system is different. Because we have first past to post elections rather than a system that provides proportional representation. There's a strong incentive for two parties in the American system, and we also by now the two parties are really integrated into the
Hmm.
structure of our election system. They basically run the election system, so that primaries are considered part of the broader election process, even though primaries are actually internal to the parties. And that means that it's extremely difficult for a third party or multiple parties to make it to the ballot in most states when it comes to statewide elections. So, to elections for Congress, for governor, certainly for president. We've seen some independent candidates do reasonably well, although it's very hard to get electoral votes when you're running for president. So Ross Perot got 20% of the vote in 1992. He didn't get a single electoral vote, and that's been the high watermark for independent candidates in modern America. It's extremely difficult for anybody to break through the two-party system, and so many of the kinds of divisions that you see between parties in the European parliamentary systems are found within parties in the American system.
Hmm.
And they take place in the primaries, and ultimately they're evident also in the party coalitions in Congress. So you've got a party where that includes both Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Joe Manchin.
Hmm.
Those people
Hmm.
would not be in the same party in Europe, even in Britain,
Right.
which really only has four parties. They just wouldn't. And in our system, they are, and the fights they have are fights that happen within a party. There's less of that kind of factionalism than there used to be, but there's still quite a bit. And I think most of that kind of fine-grained political diversity is going to keep happening within the two-party system. It would take a real
Hmm.
cataclysm for one of those parties to fall apart, or for a third party to really get somewhere in our system.
Hmm. Yeah, right. And that's a good point because Trump originally was like in I think like 2000 was thinking about doing like a reform party or unity party, something like that nature. But
Right.
instead, he just takes over the Republican Party and changes a lot of its priorities, and other people essentially follow suit
Yep.
with some of his priorities that are not adjacent to what the Republican Party used to stand for, particularly under like the Reagan types. So yeah, that's a good point. In terms of the looking at as we mentioned, where everything is a screaming match now. Everything is like end the democracy. If it doesn't go our way on this one issue, right? We don't get Build Back Better passes, end the democracy, right? We're always everything is on level 10 now. Do you
Yeah.
think that is connected to our more insular looking maybe foreign policy, right? So now there seems to be and I think this Russia-Ukraine situation is a bit of a microcosm on this matter, because America's more concerned with itself than being the leader on every global conflict, and maybe the Democrats are a bit more on the globalization side, right, as of this moment. But there does seem to be a trend, stronger on the Republican side, but in both parties, of just focusing on essentially screaming at each other about everything, and rather than playing this, hegemonic superpower role, like we're gonna solve every crisis, we're gonna be involved in every dispute and be the kingmaker and be the mediator in this Russia-Ukraine conflict. Famously, like apparently, according to the report, Saudi Arabia and the UAE didn't even take the President of the United States call back, right? Because they essentially, feel spited because maybe of the Iran nuclear deal and some of his rhetoric. And so, like, the United States kind of like off the table, and Israel, which used to be the people that we negotiate on behalf of, is now playing like a central role negotiating between the Russians and Ukrainians, and we're kind of on the back burner on that. So do you think those two things are connected, between our politics and sort of taking us away from being the interventionists around the world? And do you see that continuing to manifest itself and getting more significance?
Yeah, I think they're connected in a couple of ways. One way is that we are not really capable now of thinking about any political issue in any terms other than the other party is the problem. And that means that a lot of the issues we deal with end up being channeled through this kind of intense partisan hostility. You could see that with COVID, where pretty quickly we stopped arguing about the virus and started arguing about how terrible the other party is.
Right.
And basic issues like masks and vaccines became very divided along partisan lines in ways that don't really make any sense. I think some of that happens in foreign policy as well, where it can seem as though we're talking about Ukraine, but actually we're just talking about the other party. And we're saying this proves that these guys were always wrong and they're terrible people. And, I'm on the right side, and whatever side that may be. There are some ways that the sheer power of Ukraine's example of standing up to despotism and to an invasion of their country unified us for a period across party lines, and people could say this is something we can more or less agree on. But still, fairly quickly, we have fallen into a debate about the nature of American foreign policy that is an extremely polarized debate, and that basically has to do with what you think of Joe Biden or what you think of Donald Trump. That makes it very hard for the country to think straight about its role in the world. And I do think more broadly that in the wake of the Iraq War and in the wake of Afghanistan, there has certainly been a turn away from global responsibility, which happened first on the left, but then especially through Trumpism on the right. And there's now a tendency to think, in my view, we are overlearning the lessons of Iraq some, and coming to think that we have no constructive role to play in the world. And the right has become, if not isolationist, then certainly reticent to take responsibility and to see America as an essential player in world affairs. I think there's some danger in that, and I do think that it is very much channeled through this kind of intense partisanship, the lens that distorts our view of everything else.
Yeah, we do tend to sort of overcorrect, right? Every time we have a problem, then rather than sort of here on out reaching a solution to deal with other sorts of those problems, we just like overcorrect. And I think that the Ukrainian example is pretty interesting right now, because you see, so the Republicans in Congress are still essentially singing the same tune and sort of have the same policies, and the vast majority of them, and that they would have in the past, which is, let's be strong, let's arm Ukraine to the extent possible, let's do whatever we gotta do. Yeah. But then you have sort of these conservative and maybe influencer types or media personalities, and they're taking a weird approach that I don't like, which is, in order to sort of come out in opposition of Biden, they feel like they have to undermine Ukraine and have to poo-poo Ukraine. And to a certain extent, I get it, because of the connections with the whole Hunter Biden stuff and the fact that we've been lied to about almost everything, all these major stories and Russia gates, right? And so there's a lot of skepticism and cynicism in terms of getting back into this narrative that Russia's the enemy and the other people are the good guys no matter what. So I kind of get it, but at the same time, it's like there is an overcorrection there of, okay, well, just because they lied about Russia and all that doesn't make Russia good guys, doesn't make them any less of a evil action that they're committing right now in Ukraine. And it doesn't mean, and just because Ukraine is a corrupt country in a lot of ways, doesn't mean that we shouldn't support their right to defend themselves. That's kind of like a tenet of conservatism. So that's kind of an interesting situation. Yeah.
I think it's an example of the way that a certain kind of partisanship, tends to corrupt our politics. We end up saying, wherever that guy's saying, I'm the opposite. So that means you become a prisoner of the other party, and allow them to define where you stand on issues, rather than say, well, I don't like Joe Biden, but on this particular issue, I find myself on the same side as Joe Biden, so maybe we can work together.
Right.
That becomes very, very hard for people to do, especially, as you say, in the kind of cultural space around conservative politics. It feels like there's just no room for that kind of view.
Do you think that we're heading into a more decentralized way of doing things in terms of, one of the things the pandemic really accelerated was the self-sorting? You had a lot of people. California lost the most people ever. First time it's ever lost a congressional seat. You had 1 million people leave in the last decade. I think was it 100,000 to 200,000 nets leave last year, and a lot of the people, in my home state, who have left are, as we said, some of these working class people, some of these cultural right-leaning people, and economically right-leaning people, small business owners, etc. They're going to places like Texas. You see a similar thing. Illinois and New York, which have both lost populations in terms of net loss, and they're going to places like Florida, and so we do see a lot more of a self-sorting. Do you think that leads to more of a situation in which we're not united? Like California does its own thing, Florida does its own thing, maybe the executive branch, maybe the centralized or the congressional branch as well, that doesn't have that much of a impact on our culture, the way we think about things. We're just more focused on California if we're Californian, and more focused on Florida if we are, and less united, essentially, because that was our history in the past. Before, in the early days of the United States, you were a Virginian, you were a North Carolinian, you weren't a American necessarily. Do you see a little bit of a transition towards that?
There's a good way for that to happen and a bad way. I mean, I think that in a way, federalism allows us a kind of escape hatch from some of the most intense, divisive partisan debates by saying, if California wants to run things that way, that's fine, but I'm going to be in Texas, where we do things in a different way. That can be very constructive, but I think there are also ways in which, as you say, we come to think of ourselves as belonging essentially to two different nations, and not to think about the fate of our society as one unified whole. I actually think that at this point, our politics has become so nationalized that it's very hard for federalism to serve that kind of escape hatch role. We are very, very focused on the kinds of issues that divide us on a national level, and they've even made their way into local politics. So in the county where I live in Maryland, a lot of county council elections have to do with immigration, have to do with all kinds of issues where the people in the county council have got nothing to say about immigration. I don't care what you think about it. It's not your job to have a policy about it. And yet they run on those issues because everybody kind of understands their politics based on how they think about those issues. And so a guy will say, well, I'm a Donald Trump Republican. Well, okay, but you're running for mayor of this little town in Maryland. I don't really care what you think about Donald Trump. What are you going to do about potholes? And it's become very hard to think about politics in any way except that kind of national divide. So I tend to think that a little bit more federalism, a little bit more you do your way, we'll do our way, and we're still all Americans could be a useful thing. But in a sense, we're getting a little bit of the worst of all worlds, where we are more segregated politically than we used to be. We don't run across people who disagree with us as much as we might have. And yet, at the same time, we're all obsessed with these national issues. So we're kind of yelling at each other long distance, rather than either agreeing with each other or saying, well, you do your way, we'll do our way, and it'll be fine. We don't get either of those at the moment.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. The worst of both worlds. That does seem to be the case. I recently saw, I think it was Michelle Tandler on Twitter. She mentioned how in the San Francisco City Council, for example, has banned travel of their employees to basically most of the United States. I think the majority of the states they're not allowed to
Right.
they're not
That's
allowed to
right.
go to for personal purposes. Which is just insane. It's like, what the hell does that have to do with running San Francisco,
Yeah.
right? Um, yeah,
Right.
yeah, it is odd.
Yeah.
It's so
The
odd, and it's so
little
odd.
town of Tacoma Park, Maryland. This little town of Tacoma Park, Maryland, has declared itself a nuclear-free zone. Imagining, okay, well, that's great, but in what way
Right.
is that relevant to anything that your
Yeah.
constituents are asking of you?
Yeah, no, I mean it is so interesting, and it's also so interesting how you can, with pretty good reliability, if you go to a Erewhon, or Whole Foods in most of the country, you can pretty much assume how most people vote, and you'll be right the vast majority of the time. And if
Yep.
you go to a what would be the sort of the Republic? If you go to a NASCAR race, you can assume how everyone there is going to vote, or the vast majority, right? It's
Right.
weird, like how these sort of cultural things which are traditionally apolitical, but you could just sort of assume what people think on like a whole host of issues just by looking at these sort of external things that don't seem connected to politics, but how people self-sort themselves.
Yeah.
How do you see this decade playing out in terms of some of the stuff we discussed? Continuation of the trends, uh, continuation of these cementing coalitions, or changing coalitions first and sort of cementing in place. You mentioned there's some analogy that you could there's some analogous situations from the past. How do you see that going in this decade,
Yeah.
for example?
Well, I tend to think that we are reaching a point where there's a sufficient amount of unhappiness with the status quo on the part of a lot of voters that I do think the party coalitions come to recognize some of the ways that they need to change in order to speak to voter priorities. A lot of that is going to be generational. I do think that we're going to see the end of the reign of Americans born in the 1940s, who, after all, are going to turn 80 in the 2020s,
Mhm.
and who still run a lot of our institutions, political and cultural and otherwise. That's not going to continue forever, just by the nature of things. And
Right.
look, I wish them all long and healthy lives, but I don't think I wish them all continued control of American life into their 90s.
Mhm.
And the generational change that will follow inevitably will bring about more of a future orientation in how our politics functions. Now, there's a right leaning and a left leaning way that that will happen, but I do have some hope that our politics becomes more focused on the future needs of the country and less focused on these kinds of long standing grudges between the two party coalitions. So, on the whole, I'm actually hopeful, and I think there's a path for both parties to rescue themselves from the kind of rut they're in. But look, it'll take voter demand, and that remains to be seen.
On the business side of things, do you see any changes there in terms of the cultural climate of the businesses? You see the ESG stuff. You see, sort of this what people would describe like woke takeover of these corporations. Do you see that changing or
Yeah.
getting
Well,
more
look, I think that a
or
lot of
strengthened?
that, I think a lot of that peaks in this decade. Not that it has peaked already, but that it gets to a place where it begins to become ridiculous. It begins to become a caricature of itself, and there is a kind of public reaction against it that restrains it some. But quite frankly, I think it gets worse before it gets better. I do expect that it will get better, but I think
Mhm.
we're going to see more of the kind of coalescence of big business around progressive political priorities before there's a consumer reaction that forces them to pull back from that some.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I agree with that, and I think when you have uh, companies professing to be about social justice and then employing slave labor for all their goods, and then I think when China
Right.
eventually does something that is objectively horrific and broadcast on the world stage, similar to what Russia's doing. It's going to be very interesting to see these companies who have like no business interest in Russia speak out against Russia, see how they come out against China, where they have a significant portion
Yeah.
of their economic livelihoods tied into, and if they continue with this sort of hypocritical approach, it's just going to be so clear for everybody to see. And I think you're going to see a lot of people um, on the left who are intellectually honest point that out, right? Because it's just going to be untenable at a certain point.
Yeah. I agree with that. I think it gets to a point where it can't continue. I wish we were there now, but we're not. But we will get there,
Yeah.
and I do think that a lot of this is going to have to be rethought.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Yuval Levin, it was an amazing discussion. Really appreciate it. I learned so much. I think it was fascinating. Where can people find you?
People can find me at the American Enterprise Institute, AEI.org. You can see everything that I write and publish there. And thank you for this. It was really wonderful.
Really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
If you enjoyed our show, please click subscribe to stay up to date with our YouTube channel and podcast, and give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts so that we can keep delivering guys some great content. Thanks for listening, and we will be back next week.
We're going to talk about the issues that really matter. Our country, our economy, the Fed, QE, GDP, BTC, NFTs, AOC, the CCP, Cardi B, Yeezy, Yellow Socks, Iran, Joe Biden's dementia,
Come on, man!
and probably sex robots. We stand for a free and open debate and exchange of ideas. And if you disagree with anything we talk about, you are a racist and no better than Hitler.
What?
Let's get started.